In the spring of 2022, Dr. Margaret Sullivan, a constitutional scholar from Yale Law School, found herself in the most unlikely place for someone studying democratic theory, the Israeli Knesset, during a heated debate about judicial reform. She had come to Jerusalem expecting to witness a textbook example of democratic dysfunction. What she discovered instead would fundamentally challenge everything she thought she knew about how democracy actually works under pressure. As she sat in the gallery watching lawmakers shout at each other in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, something struck her as profoundly wrong with the narrative she had been taught. Here was a country that Western academics routinely criticized as increasingly undemocratic, yet it was engaged in the most intense democratic debate she had ever witnessed. The passion, the engagement, the stakes. This wasn't the death of democracy. This was democracy operating at maximum intensity. But the real revelation came during a private conversation with a veteran Israeli politician after the session. "You Americans," he said with a weary smile, "you think democracy is about being nice to each other. You think it's about consensus and politeness and everyone getting along. But that's not democracy. That's dinner party conversation. Real democracy is about survival. It's about making life and death decisions when everyone disagrees and the enemy is at the gate." That conversation would haunt Dr. Sullivan for months because it exposed the comfortable illusion at the heart of Western democratic theory. We have spent decades studying democracy as if it were an academic exercise, as if the greatest threat to democratic institutions was partisan gridlock or declining trust in media. But Israel operates democracy under conditions that would break any Western system within months. Existential threats, permanent security crises, and a society where every political decision carries life and death consequences. This is not a story about Israeli exceptionalism or Middle Eastern dysfunction. This is a story about the future of democracy everywhere. Because what Israel reveals is that our entire understanding of democratic governance has been shaped by an historical anomaly, the brief period of Western peace and prosperity following World War II. But that era is ending. And as Western democracies face their own existential challenges, from climate change to technological disruption to great power competition, they are discovering that Israel hasn't been departing from democratic norms. It has been pioneering the democracy of the 21st century, the comfortable democracy. The Western model of democracy that emerged after 1945 was built on a foundation of unprecedented security and prosperity. For the first time in human history, major democratic powers could afford to treat politics as a kind of civilized debate society. Elections became peaceful transfers of power between parties that fundamentally agreed on the basic structure of society. Political disagreements were about marginal tax rates and healthcare policies, not about whether the nation would survive the next decade. This created what political scientists call consensus democracy, a system where the major parties operate within agreed-upon boundaries and where the greatest political sin is not being wrong, but being uncivil. It produced the politics of endless parliamentary debates, of carefully worded diplomatic statements, of politicians who spent more time managing their public image than managing actual crises. But this comfortable democracy was always a luxury good, dependent on specific historical conditions that most of the world never enjoyed. It required geographical isolation from major threats, economic dominance that could paper over structural problems, and a civil society insulated from the raw realities of power competition. It was democracy for a world that no longer exists. Israel never had that luxury. From its first day of existence, Israeli democracy has operated under conditions that would be considered emergency powers in any Western country. It has never known a single year without active military threats. It has never enjoyed the geographic buffer that allows European nations to debate refugee policy without worrying about demographic survival. It has never had the economic margin that allows American politicians to treat trillion-dollar deficits as abstract policy questions. This has produced what might be called pressure democracy, a system designed not for peaceful deliberation, but for rapid decision-making under extreme uncertainty. And understanding how this system works reveals uncomfortable truths about what democracy actually requires to survive in a hostile world. The security democracy. The first principle of Israeli democracy is that democratic processes must be subordinated to democratic survival. This sounds paradoxical to Western ears, but it reflects a brutal lesson that most Western democracies have never had to learn. There is no point in having perfect democratic procedures if those procedures lead to the elimination of the democracy itself. This principle manifests in ways that make Western observers deeply uncomfortable. Israeli democracy routinely makes decisions that would be impossible in consensus-based systems. It mobilizes the entire adult population during wartime without asking permission from opposition parties. It restricts certain civil liberties during security crises without requiring judicial approval. It treats national security information as genuinely secret rather than as material for political point scoring. But here is what Western critics miss. These restrictions are not imposed by an authoritarian government on Volksbos, a helpless population. They are embraced by the population as necessary conditions for democratic survival. Israeli voters routinely elect governments that promise tougher security measures, not in spite of their democratic values, but because of them. They understand intuitively what Western political theory has forgotten: that individual rights depend on collective survival. This creates a paradox that challenges liberal democratic theory at its core. Israeli democracy is simultaneously more restrictive and more participatory than Western systems. It gives the government extraordinary powers during crises, but it also subjects those powers to more intense scrutiny than any Western democracy would tolerate. Consider the aftermath of every Israeli military operation. Within hours of the fighting ending, Israeli media begins conducting forensic investigations of government decision-making that would be impossible in wartime America or Britain. Opposition politicians demand detailed briefings on classified operations. Military commanders face public questioning about their tactical decisions. The public expects this level of accountability precisely because they have granted such extensive powers to their leaders. This is democracy as a high-stakes partnership between citizens and government, rather than democracy as a consumer service where citizens periodically choose between competing products. It requires a level of civic engagement that would exhaust most Western electorates, but it also produces a level of governmental responsiveness that Western voters can only dream of. The innovation democracy. The second principle of Israeli democracy is that democratic institutions must be constantly adapted to changing circumstances. While Western democracies treat their constitutional structures as sacred texts to be preserved unchanged, Israeli democracy treats its institutions as engineering problems to be optimized for performance. This pragmatic approach to democratic governance produces innovations that seem bizarre to Western observers, but prove remarkably effective under pressure. The Israeli system blends proportional representation with executive authority in ways that shouldn't work according to political science textbooks, but somehow produce both representation and decisiveness. Consider the Israeli approach to coalition government. Western observers routinely predict that Israel's fractured party system will lead to governmental paralysis. And yet, Israeli governments consistently make faster, more decisive policy choices than the supposedly more efficient presidential or parliamentary systems of larger democracies. How is this possible? The answer lies in what might be called crisis coalition dynamics. Israeli parties understand that governmental collapse during a security crisis is not just politically costly, but potentially existential. This creates incentives for compromise and collaboration that don't exist in peacetime democracies. Coalition partners who might spend months arguing about budget details in normal circumstances can reach agreement on complex security policies within hours when faced with external threats. This doesn't mean Israeli coalition politics are harmonious. Quite the opposite. The level of internal conflict within Israeli governments would destroy most Western cabinets within weeks. But Israeli politicians have learned to distinguish between disagreements that matter for governance and disagreements that matter for survival. They can fight bitterly over domestic policies while maintaining unity on existential questions. The result is a democratic system that combines the representational benefits of proportional democracy with the decisiveness of majoritarian systems. It produces governments that are both highly responsive to diverse social interests and capable of rapid action when circumstances require it. The transparency democracy. The third principle of Israeli democracy is that democratic accountability requires extreme transparency, even during wartime. This might seem to contradict the security imperative discussed earlier, but it actually reinforces it. Israeli democracy has learned that public trust in security decisions requires public understanding of security logic, even when specific operations must remain classified. This produces a level of public discourse about national security that would be impossible in most democracies. Israeli media routinely publish detailed analyses of military strategy, intelligence assessments, and diplomatic negotiations that would be considered treasonous in wartime America or Britain. Opposition politicians receive security briefings that most Western legislators never see. Academic experts have access to government officials and classified information that would require security clearances in other countries. But this transparency comes with corresponding expectations of civic responsibility. Israeli citizens who receive this level of access to sensitive information are expected to use it responsibly, to distinguish between legitimate criticism and reckless endangerment, and to maintain their democratic obligations even when they disagree with specific policies. The result is a public that is far more informed about the actual complexities of governance than citizens of most democracies, and therefore far more capable of making sophisticated judgments about governmental performance. Israeli voters don't just vote on the basis of economic performance or cultural affinity. They vote based on detailed assessments of strategic competence and crisis management capability. This creates a feedback loop that continuously improves governmental performance. Politicians who make poor strategic decisions face immediate and informed criticism from a public that understands exactly what went wrong and why. This level of accountability would be politically suicidal for most Western politicians. but it produces better decision-making by forcing leaders to think through the likely public response to their choices before making them. The paradox resolution. What emerges from this analysis is not a picture of Israeli democracy as a departure from democratic norms, but as an evolution of democratic practice under pressure. Israeli democracy has solved problems that Western democracies don't yet realize they face because Western democracies haven't yet faced the conditions that force these solutions. But those conditions are coming. Climate change will create permanent crisis conditions for many democracies. Great power competition is returning to levels not seen since the Cold War. Technological disruption is accelerating the pace of change beyond the capacity of traditional democratic institutions to manage. Economic inequality is reaching levels that threaten social cohesion in most Western countries. Under these circumstances, Western democracies will face the same choice that Israel faced in 1948: adapt democratic practice to new realities, or watch democracy fail under the pressure of circumstances it was not designed to handle. The Israeli example suggests that this adaptation is possible, but it requires abandoning comfortable assumptions about how democracy should work and embracing uncomfortable truths about how democracy must work to survive. It requires treating democratic institutions as tools for collective survival rather than as ends in themselves. It requires accepting higher levels of governmental power in exchange for higher levels of governmental accountability. It requires a more engaged and informed citizenry willing to accept the responsibilities that come with democratic participation. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the choice is not between perfect democracy and imperfect democracy, but between adapted democracy and failed democracy. The Israeli system is not perfect. No democracy is. But it is functional under conditions that would destroy most democratic systems within months. This is the democratic paradox that Israel has solved and that Western democracies will soon be forced to confront. Democracy can survive almost anything except the insistence that it remain unchanged. The question facing Western democracies is not whether they will face Israeli-level pressures in the coming decades. They will. The question is whether they will learn from the Israeli example before those pressures arrive, or whether they will cling to the comfortable democracy of the post-war era until it collapses under the weight of 21st century realities. The mirror that Israel holds up to Western democracy is not flattering, but it may be essential, because in the end, the greatest threat to democratic values may not be external enemies or internal divisions, but the refusal to admit that democratic practice must evolve to preserve democratic principles. In a world that no longer resembles the one in which our current democratic institutions were designed to operate.